Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon, and welcome to the 5th of December Digital Classicist London Seminar. Today we are having Harry Tanner from the National University of Ireland. He's doing his PhD there. And we are also having Gabriel Bodart and Lucia Vanini. Gabriel is also a co-organizer of the seminar. I'm gonna ask my other, well, everybody is mute already, so I'm gonna mute myself, and I'm going to pass it to Harry. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Can you see my screen? I should be able to. There we go. Awesome. Right. So, hello, everybody. My name is Harry, as I've just been introduced. Thank you very much by Paula. And also thank you very much as well to Gabby and Paula for making such an effort to take this online today when all other conferences have been cancelled. This is absolutely amazing. So thank you very much for that. Today I'm going to be presenting a paper on integrating computational methods in detecting semantic drift in words into traditional Greek lexicography and hopefully get them to talk to each other a bit more. I'd also like to thank initially Barbara McGillivray for reading an early draft of the paper that accompanies this. Obviously, any errors are mine, but that was enormously kind of her, so thank you. And to my supervisor, Professor Michael Clark, too. Finally, an apology as well. This research has mostly been done under COVID, so there's been a lack of library resources that has impacted it, but hopefully it's not too problematic. If a question does occur to you in the talk, then you can use the live comment section as well, I think. So fantastic. Let's get going. Let's take a look at the current picture of Greek lexicography as it stands. This is the Little Scott Jones lexicon, the LSJ. It's an entry with the word numper, which is a nymph. This is how much Greek lexicography looks, whether it be the more up-to-date Montanari lexicon or this one. As you can see, different senses of the word delineated in quite, as Anne Thompson said, a linear alphabetic layout on the printed page. So this linear layout gives us this impression that all of the senses that you can see on the screen occurred in the same time period. Which they didn't. If you look in more detail at some of the references, you can see that they occurred in different time periods. But on first glance, it may be quite difficult to see the nuances in different time periods, the different senses that were current in different time periods. So this is a crucial problem in Greek lexicography. It's the lack of diachronic treatment. There's no explicit suggestion of dating, no explicit suggestion of period change. So we're encouraged to conflate the word diachronically. Now, there are some cases, as James Claxon has pointed out in Greek lexicography, where words are to change their meaning. Here, Chantren shows us that ethel, which usually means I want in Homer, vouloir, while boulomai usually means to desire or to prefer. Whereas in Attic prose, boulomai has replaced ethelo in the sense of want and desire. So there's clearly been a drift there from Homer to the 5th century in terms of the meaning of words. We can see is occasionally documented in Greek lexicography. And it's not a radical change in terms of the meaning. It doesn't involve metaphorical shift or the use of any other literary device like irony. We're talking about gradual drift, the motivation for change in the vast majority of words in human language. So which words change and which words don't is our crucial question. We can see that Greek lexicography has often been shown not to account for this. James Claxon talks about how the LSJ usually treats largely ahistorical terms. And he expresses the wish that we could imagine a reference work on Greek lexicography which shows developments over time, an expansion and contraction in meanings. And there's also been the common observation that Greek word meaning does change. All spoken languages change, Nikiforou says, and Lejeune comments that every language undergoes modifications in its vocabulary. So we've got these observations of change. You've got lots of articles and books on the philology of word change in individual Greek words, and yet little treatment in traditional lexicography. So we need to fix this problem. And the way that we do this is we the way that we could do this is we could use machine learning to track semantic drift. This has been done in a number of languages already. For a full overview, see Kutuzov et al. Our aim is that those words which drift and are in need of better lexicographical treatment can be brought to the attention much faster of lexicographers. It's a bit like a digital metal detector for lexicography. We don't expect it will always be accurate. A human still has to verify whether a traditional metal detector has unearthed the Sutton Hoo helmet or a baked bean can. There will still need to be a human level of verification to this. But we are after a meaningful solution that can speed up this progress and not just modeling for modeling's sake. Now, how in current computational linguistics do we treat word meaning? Well, word meaning is treated really as probability. The question for any algorithm is, what is the probability of encountering this word in any given context? The objective then of the semantic neural network, and I will give an example of this in a second, the objective of the semantic neural network is to maximize the probability of correctly guessing a word given its context. So we give a more concrete example of that. If you give the context, the boy wrote of his deep something for his friend, the goal of the algorithm is to maximize the probability that the computer will guess love or affection or some similar word, or vice versa. Given the word, it will be able to guess these contexts. This is done purely on the probability of encountering the word, because different words are clustered around different contexts, naturally in language. It doesn't mean the computer understands what the word means. The computer hasn't got any memory, it doesn't have any emotional capability, it doesn't understand the word. It just sees patterns in the use of the word. For more of the maths and the mathematical background to this, Goldberg's 2017 book is fantastic. My bibliography will be at the end of this. And also Goldberg and Levy in their 2014 paper have derived the word-to-vec algorithm that I'm going to be talking about. So just in brief, how is word-to-vec different? Well, firstly, word-to-vec, which was an innovation of Mikhailov et al. In two papers, 2013a and 2013b, a major innovation of theirs was to use a neural network to establish this probability of word meaning. And to do this, they use a simple technique called negative sampling. And this can be roughly thought of as learning from mistakes. So take this word love, which is our target word. We want to know what this word means. And we take a series of correct context words, words that are found in very close proximity to this word. So on the left-hand side, you can see a correct context example. This might be from a phrase like, I have a strong love and passion for you, my darling, I want to see you, something like that. And the computer just extracted those words, and this is the correct context. The computer gives a score for the word love and a score for each of the context words. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to correctly guess the word based upon the context scores. It also throws in some false contexts, as you can see on the right-hand side, which might be a bill, for example, and doesn't contain the word love. And it's iterating through the neural network until it can, as close as possible, tell that the word love belongs in this context, which is to say that it now understands the probability of the word in any given context. Again, for the formal mathematics of negative sampling, do see Goldberg and Levy's paper 2014. So word2vec then, this is the software package that was developed by Mikhailov et al. And it comes in two main architectures. The first architecture is to use continuous bag of words, or CBAL for short, to use the context to predict the word in question. So you'd use the context of the previous sentence that we had a couple of slides ago to try and predict the word. Well, the other way around is skipgram, which tries to predict the context based upon the word. CBAL does not care about word order, whereas skipgram does. It's got an architectural model for dealing with that. one of the parameters of the model is you specify the dimensionality of the vectors, and the vectors being the mathematical representation of the word probability, which we've already talked about. Word2Vec is not problem-free. It suffers from a serious problem called meaning conflation deficiency. And what this means, in essence, I've tried to describe it with this diagram, is that if you take a word like bank, which has got multiple different meanings to it. You could have a financial bank, the building where you go and get your money out, or and then you have a river bank. Two clearly different senses in the English language, where the word is used differently without reference to the other sense. Computer currently has no means with Word2Vec of telling which sense it's dealing with. The consequence of this is that it conflates all senses into one. So the senses in which it can mean something like water, river, bank, boats, those are similar words, and the sense in which it can mean money, finance, and currency all get pulled closer together. So the effect is that words seem closer together in semantic space with Word2Vec than perhaps they actually are. And we call this meaning conflation deficiency. For a further explanation and review, see Kamako-Kalados and Pilavar 2018, again, my bibliography at the end of the paper. So how would we track drift? Well, we would start by trying to look at how we would track the difference between different words in the same time period. Take this example here of lion, Africa, and laptop. We know intuitively that laptop is different in meaning from lion and Africa. Lion and Africa tend to appear in the same sort of context. That doesn't make them a synonym in traditional terms. It does mean they're in the same context, and so Word2Vec considers them to be closely semantically related. So the cosine similarity between them will be quite small, quite a small angle. Cosine similarity is an angular measure of distance in non-zero values, and it can be used on high-dimensional vectors. So it's very, very useful for our purposes. So you've got lion and Africa, which will be quite close together, but laptop is quite far away. So that cosine angle is going to be much higher, is the idea. So the cosine similarity ranges from 0, very different, to 1, very similar. The higher the cosine similarity, the more similar, in other words. In our case, then, instead of measuring similarity between different words in the same time period, we're going to measure similarity between the same word in different time periods. So instead of between lion and laptop, we would be between lion in Homer and lion in the 5th century, for example. This involves some alignment between the time periods, which I'm going to talk about later. There have been other approaches to do a very similar thing. Hamilton et al. Have proposed 2 laws of semantic drift, the law of conformity and the law of innovation. It's also been used by Hellerick and Holland to visualize macro changes in semantics, specifically on specific languages. Dubosarski, his 2016 paper, Haim Dubosarski in his 2016 paper, used Word2Vec to track semantic drift in English, using the Google Books corpus. And Nina Tamasebi used Swedish newspapers in her 2018 paper to track, again, semantic drift in those 2 areas. In both cases, Word2Vec and cosine similarity was used. In Greek, this has happened too. So Perroni et al. Tracked semantic drift in Greek using predetermined sense numbers and genres. That wasn't using word embeddings. Roder et al. Also tracked macro changes in Greek vocabulary from the 1st millennium to BCE to the 1st millennium CE. And McGillivray et al. Do a similar thing, recruit classics expertise for the manual sense tracking. Now, in each of those cases, computational methods have been successfully deployed to track word change in Greek. What I want to do is move that on a little bit, and that's to detect new words of interest. So it's an extension of existing attempts, but I designed to detect new words that we can use in lexicographical studies. The obvious question then comes up: how do we know that this metal detector works? Whole books and articles are written about individual Greek words. So we can't just take the cosine similarity and say, well, 0.1 corresponds perfectly onto this whole book. That's a very weak suggestion. So we need some sort of numerical distillation, crude as it may seem, of the details of the philology, which can be compared against the cosine similarity. What this enables us to do, in essence, is to set up a hypothesis. I suggest the use of something called a substitution factor. The substitution factor enables us to create this hypothesis. The hypothesis might be something like this. If a word has a high cosine similarity, we will expect this substitution factor. Let's talk about how the substitution factor works. You take two different uses of the word in different time periods, which align closely with each other. They're the most similar sense to each other, as it were. So in this case, I've taken Homer Iliad 1, just as this is a completely arbitrary example, Mein Nayeda Teya, and Sophocles' Ajax, Meinin Badeyan, on the other end, so Homer to the 5th century comparison. And what we're asking is this word menis, the sense in both cases, could they easily be substituted for each other? Could they easily mean the same thing as each other? Now, in this case, yes, they do, because Sophocles, as has been noted in commentary, is probably actively imitating Homer here. So the substitution factor tells us how close two senses are to each other from the philological data. And it enables us to craft a hypothesis. If a word has high cosine similarity, we will expect a high substitution factor of 5 or 6, or vice versa. It's crude, but it makes for a much fairer test, I think, than saying something like, after labeling an analysis of shift, I will expect to see a high degree of similarity. Well, how do you define a high degree of similarity? How do you measure that? This is a means to do that, and it helps us to evaluate the hypotheses. And let's take a quick peek at the Word2Vec embeddings once they were trained. Just to talk through how they were trained then and what we're looking at here. What you're looking at here, for some reason the X and Y axes are not labeled. I don't know why that is, sorry. The X axis here is the century in question. So on the right-hand side, what you can see is the century that ends minus 800 BCE, next one minus 700 BCE, minus 600 BCE. You'll notice there's no minus 500 because the data wasn't there. For reasons I will talk about in a second. And on the y-axis, we can see the accuracy rating per century. And I'm going to talk about how I came up with this accuracy rating. Firstly, how was the Word2Vec trained? And then how did I obtain these accuracy ratings? It was trained on Vatry and McGillivrary's diaresis corpus. I firstly excluded stop words, as is standard in NLP, like particles, conjunctions, pronouns, proper names, words that don't have huge amounts of meaning or easily derived meaning from context. I've got a full list of that in my written paper. Synchronous and then asynchronous centuries. On the left-hand side, we've got asynchronous centuries, A to H. An asynchronous century is a century in which you might have a bit of Homer, so you might have the Iliad, and then you might have a bit of something from the 5th century, and you might have a bit of something from the 1st century BCE. The purpose of this is to create a series of random text, shuffled texts, that enable us to control what the real synchronous centuries are producing. So if the synchronous century minus 800 or minus 700 says that there is a significant change between minus 800 and minus 700, for example, we would expect that change to be truly significant if it is higher than the mean for the asynchronous centuries. So it acts as a control and enables us to find real drift and not just noise. This was initially proposed by Dubosarski, 2016. How did I measure the accuracy ratings for Word2Vec that you can see on the screen now? The computer presented me, you see the code on GitHub, the computer presented me with a correct synonym set, a series of words that occur in a similar kind of context, to a word that was found in each century. and an incorrect synonym set. I had to guess which one was the correct one and which was the incorrect one over 3 words per century. These are the accuracy scores that I scored, as it were. And I took this to be an indicator, as an expert in Greek, of how accurate the model was. So the results came in at an average across the centuries of a 77.86% accuracy. That is actually probably higher than I'd initially expected. There's several reasons why that is. Firstly, Greek texts, as we know, are peppered with literary devices. They're not quotidian language, and that makes it really difficult to identify synonym sets. Secondly, Word2Vec, as we've already said, conflates polysemy in words, and it makes it very hard to determine proper synonym sets on Greek. Thirdly, none of us actually know ancient Greek. None of us speak it fluently, and none of us speak it like a native speaker, crucially. So it's going to be quite difficult to identify synonym sets. Having said that, I think that the accuracy score does rather well on inspection. Crucially, the centuries that we are interested in this paper, Homer and the 5th century and the 4th century, all scored a 100% accuracy rating. It should be noted additionally that it doesn't necessarily matter if Word2Vec isn't synchronically precisely accurate. Even if the model isn't precisely accurate, it can still detect change. For example, if it thinks that bank is not a financial institution but a word for a building, it would still detect the large-scale change that it underwent from when it originally meant a bench, as bank is in modern-day German. You would still detect that change. It doesn't necessarily matter that it's not exactly right. So I've already mentioned how important it is to align the different centuries so that the cosine similarity is accurate. Now, you can use overlap to do this. You can overlap different centuries on top of each other. So you've got a bit of Homer in a bit of the next century. Or you can use linear algebraic methods like orthogonal procrustes. In this paper, I've gone for overlap, but I have used procrustes elsewhere, and as has Barbara McGillivray. So now that we have inspected the data, it seems that we've got some pretty good levels of accuracy for those small training sets. We've now overlapped the centuries, and we've computed a cosine similarity for each word per century. I then ranked the similarities, and I compared them against the asynchronous as a control. For this word, numpair, the control was 0.4716. So you can see that this is much higher than the control. So we can say that this is a genuine small shift. This word had the lowest level of change for a shift. So the hypothesis would be that this word underwent a small shift. We would say that the substitution factor would be somewhere in the region of 5 or 6 because it underwent a very small shift. So we can frame our hypothesis, and now we can get onto the Greek data to test it. So let's take a first look at the substitution table that I built for this word. On the left-hand side, you can see a linear description of the different senses that I found upon manual inspection of each instance of this word. And you can see an example of each case that I've written. I've also taken the step of labeling it in discrete time periods A, B, and C and describing each one. Of course, we know that time periods are not discrete in real life, but that's just a convenience, unfortunately, that we have to live with. The table on the right provides my summary account of the substitution factors, which range from the sense described in the table on the left, and then a brief comment. I must say that these substitution factors are absolutely open to interrogation and discussion. I'm going to give an example of how I came up with one of them. The full reasoning for all of them can be found in my written paper, which is available on request. So there exists a brilliant book on Greek nymphs. Jennifer Larson's Greek Nymphs provides an account of synchronous attitudes to Greek nymphs, the divine form of nymphs, from both textual and archaeological data. And I note that Larson on page 20 remarks that the word numpair proves to be remarkably stable through time with only a few major developments occurring later. This is promising. It suggests that the computer is correct. But what about the young woman sense, which is not the same as the nymph sense? You can see the LSJ entry underneath there. What about that young woman sense? Let's take a look at the data. So here what we've got is, on the left-hand side, we've got Homer Odyssey 11, and on the right-hand side, we've got the Homeric Hymn to Aphrodite, where both words occur in different time periods. We're going to talk about them and come to a substitution factor for this word between the time periods. On the left, Homer Odyssey 11, Odysseus is telling the tale of how he sacrificed in a 2-foot square pit, and the shades came from Erebus. First to greet him are the unmarried young women. We know that they're unmarried young women, numpai, and because they're paired with the te eetioi, which are the unmarried young men, quite explicitly so. So we can infer that these are unmarried young women, and they're the first to come and greet him on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, in the Homeric Hymn to Aphrodite, the Homeric hymn has Aphrodite, who has pretended to Anchises that she is mortal. She's done that on the preceding lines 1110 to 1111. She describes her mortal sisters, as it were, Polai de numpai, kai partenoi al pespioi. We, many young women and virgins with dowries, play. The explicit mention of the virgins with dowries, again, suggests that the grouping is young unmarried women. So we would give this a substitution factor of 6 because it's the same sense in both cases. You could substitute both senses and mean pretty much the same thing. So both words, you can mean pretty much the same thing, same sense. So the substitution factor of 6, again, very much open to discussion and interpretation. That's part of the point. And then on the left-hand side, into the next time period, the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite and Euripides' Hecuba. Aphrodite, again, as we've seen, pretends to Anchises that she's a mortal woman. This is exactly the same section we've seen before. On the right-hand side, Hecuba has just been informed that her daughter, Polyxena, has been raped and killed. And she calls Polyxena here a numpen ta numpon, just before the caesura. She describes her there as a young woman who is unmarried, anumpon. And the other half, partenon ta partenon, a virgin defiled. Here the sense is clearly for a numper, a young woman who is unmarried. In Greek burial custom, young women who remain unmarried would be buried with the jar for carrying their marital bathwater. Greek culture saw the woman's role as to be married. To die short of this role was to die before their time. So Euripides' use of numper here is for a young woman. It may, of course, also allude, possibly, to a sense of bride as well, the idea that she didn't manage to be a bride. There may be some kind of tragic allusion there. Nonetheless, it seems to be saliently the same sense of the word, an unmarried young woman. So we would give it a substitution factor of 6. I really welcome the idea that you have classicists who aren't collaborating together in the sense that they're not talking to each other while they're working on the data, but they produce substitution factors and compare their substitution factors on that same data post-analysis. Do they agree that 6 is a fair substitution factor for A.1a to B.1a to C.1a? And then there's a reminder of the table there. Do they agree with that? I would welcome that. I think that would be a very interesting way to interrogate the data. So just a reminder of the figures on numpair there, and we can see that it roughly corresponds with what we would expect there. Now, let's take a look at what the computer decided was a case of big shift. Okay, so a word like ananwewo here. And ananwewo here has a very low mean cosine similarity, which you can see between 800 to 600 BCE, and 700 to 400 BCE. So we're expecting a very big shift in meaning. We didn't get that, unfortunately. And I'm going to be going into more detail as to why I think that is and what we did get. So what we did get, here you can see, as we had before, was on the left-hand side, you've got a series of different senses. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a substitution table. Well, as you can see, the substitution factor that we've got is 5 and 4 for the next time period. So there is some change, but it's not an extraordinarily huge leap, as perhaps we may have expected. Now, there may be many explanations for this. It may not be that Word2Vec has got it completely wrong. It might be that there just isn't such thing as a word that completely leaps in meaning from Homer to the 5th century. That may be the case. I don't necessarily think it is that simple. I think that the model is probably not entirely right when it comes to this word. But let's talk about how. So let's do our substitution factor. Homer Iliad 6 here on the left-hand side. It's a famous book for the meeting between Andromache and Hector. And here the maids are sacrificing to Pallas Athene, begging her to shatter Diomedes' spear. The idea is that Pallas Athene rejects their request. She anverve de Pallas Athene. A scholiast comments on this point that the idea is that anverve, of course, meaning nod the head back, to refuse something, to request, to reject a request. And the scholiast comments that this is geloia, it's laughable, the idea that a statue would nod its head back in disagreement is laughable, they say. Richard Hunter has argued, though, that it describes the goddess refusing per se and not a movement of the head backwards. So it probably means he refused independently of the idea of the head moving. When Achilles prays to Zeus to spare Patroclus' life, Zeus half grants the prayer, heteron idoke, and he half refuses it, heteron denwelse. The antithesis there of anwelse and idoke gives the impression that ananweo may already be lexicalized in Homer. Lexicalized is to say that it's become like the word decline, which once meant to lean sideways or to lean down, but now it predominantly means to refuse. And so speaker and listener do not even think of the idea of moving down. In this case, speaker and listener in Homer's time are not even thinking of annuel meaning a move back of the head. They're not thinking etymologically. They're thinking as normal speakers think, and they just understand it to mean refuse. That seems sound. On the right-hand side, you've got Homeric hymn, the Homeric hymn to Demeter here, where Metaneira is offering Demeter a cupful of honeyed wine. But Metaneira here danenwels. She refused it because it was not semiton, it was not lawful for her to drink it. So there you've got something that is a little bit like an offering being refused, but it's the offering itself. It's not actually a request that goes with it. So there is change there, and I think we give that a substitution factor of 5. Then, if you go into the next time period, you can see the Homeric hymn to Demeter here on the left-hand side, exactly the same section as before. And on the right-hand side, we've got Aristophanes, Lysistrata here. And Lysistrata is trying to persuade, as those who will be familiar with the plot, her fellow women that they should go on a sex strike. And here she asks them, as they seem reluctant to do so, Ti mumaote, kanweote. Why are you making grimaces? Signs of refusal, which would probably also mean the nodding back of the head as well. It's a body language thing. Why are you doing that, she says. The shift is rather large here, or larger than we've seen in Nympha. It's gone from declining drink, a goddess declining drink, to, or also an offering, to Lysistrata asking why her fellow mortal women are declining to do as she suggests. quite a different sense. We give it a substitution factor there, I think, of 4. So the conclusion on our well is it's obvious that a substitution factor of 5 is not corresponding well with the mean cosine similarity of 0.055. And the substitution factor of 4 does not wholly correspond to the cosine similarity of 0.075. There. So, as I've already said, perhaps this is because no word does change its meaning significantly during this time period. I'm not sure about that one. Perhaps it vindicates the hypothesis of drift, that all words gradually change meaning, and they don't leap in terms of meaning. They don't metaphorically change, as we've often been told since Préal. Or perhaps the model is just faulty. I don't think it's that either, because it is picking up on something. There are lower substitution factors here. At any rate, the substitution factor has at least enabled us to fairly hypothesize and to test our hypothesis. It's enabled us to go back to the data and say, well, this doesn't quite make sense, or this does make sense. So it's a very powerful tool for interrogating the data. In initial experimentation, which is outside of this paper, I'm talking about future directions now, non-overlap studies are proving fruitful for higher rates of change, and they may be better at detecting higher rates of change, I'm finding at the moment, than the overlapped study that I presented here today. I'm also experimenting with automatically tagging senses using Chinese whispers, which is trained on word-to-vec nearest neighbors, and that helps us to overcome the meaning conflation deficiency. Hopefully that will be fruitful as well. So this promises to be fertile ground for future research, and particularly thanks as well, I want to make personal thanks to Barbara McGillivray at the Alan Turing Institute, because she's given me so much of her time to someone who's not a mathematician or computer scientist, but a classicist. And this research is very fertile. We're going to do some really interesting things here. But we need a way to make sure that in classics, these models are meaningful. And the substitution factor seems to me to be a fair way of doing it. Substitution factor is an effective means of creating a hypothesis and testing it for each word that a model might throw up. So hopefully in the next few years, we can start to solve the problem of a lack of drift in Greek lexicography. For the code on GitHub, for bibliography, as well as the data, do a screen grab now and grab that QR code. You can also get it off me separately, and get in contact with me as well. The information's on there. If you want to see the written paper, I'd be delighted to share it with you. Thank you very, very much for listening. And again, thank you so much to Gabby and Paula for bringing this online and making it so accessible for everybody. It's amazing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. That was brilliant. I'm amazed by the QR code at the end for people to access the bibliography and get in touch. That was great. And also I found very interesting the drift hypothesis and how all the words have the potential to change their meaning around time. That was really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to ask our yes, Lucia is there and Gabby as well. If they have any questions about the presentations, we didn't get any comments. Yes, Gabby.
I have a couple of quick questions while we're waiting for the live audience to chip in if they feel like it. So this was fabulous. Thank you very much, Harry. I really enjoyed this. The mathematics was beyond me, but the arguments I think were very clear and compelling. I'm sure you've thought of this, but and maybe you mentioned it, but in your Ananewain example, does the fact that the scholiast, comments on, why does she say the statue tilted its head back? That's absurd. Does that support your hypothesis that the meaning has changed even more in even later Greek? And could you include more of that much later Greek corpus in your testing to see whether that backs that up?
Certainly, I think so. And actually, some just off memory, I can't remember a specific name, but a lot of 19th century German scholarship concerns changes in Alexandrian scholiast and changes in meaning. And so, yes, it's possible that it could be that the scholiast thinks that ananuel means to do that with your head and thinks that that's ridiculous. And that would be a good example of drift. But again, it's a really good example of drift because it's not gone very far in terms of its meaning. This is how we've spent, if you read most books on semantic change, they'll spend a lot of time talking about things like metaphor and irony and literary devices. But it seems slightly unintuitive when you think about language on a daily basis. We're not aware on a daily basis of word meaning shifting. And yes, it does. There are loads and loads of cases of words that have shifted even in the last 50 years. You only need to look at the LSJ, and many people have written on some, I think Anne Thompson has written on the archaisms in the LSJ. And you only need to look at the LSJ to see some archaic words that are only a century old, and some archaic uses of words as well. I can give quite a funny example if I've got time to do this. I was teaching a class once, and I got them to look up the entry for cyclops in the Lewis and Short. And it was derision all over the classroom because it describes it as a fabulous monster, which of course it means in the sense of a fable in the Victorian sense of the word, but to a modern audience that means, oh my goodness, it's a fabulous monster. So that's a really good example of semantic drift in action. But yeah, thank you for that point.
Okay.
I mean, LSJ is also archaic for late 19th century audiences as well, I'm sure. I mean, they deliberately use. I mean, they use all sorts of bowdlerizations as well, which. But yeah, that's and we've seen word changes in the last 20 years as as different media have come into wide use and so forth.
Mouse.
Right.
And I think it's been put quite well by Traugott and Dasher. I can add them to my bibliography. They're not actually in it at the moment, but in their book Regularity and Semantic Change, that a lot of semantic change appears on the surface to be metaphor. It appears to be metonymy. The example that they give, actually, I'm recalling now, so I might not get this exactly right, is with evolution in Darwinian theory. They say that appears to be the idea of something evolving, moving over and over and over, and thus that's his word. And they demonstrate that actually that's not the case. That the word is an example of gradual change in meaning. They don't use the word drift, but they do steer away sometimes from the use of words like metaphor and metonymy to describe semantic change. I think that there are cases, by the way, of words that do use metaphor to shift. A word like cosmos, for example, that is a really good case because the Pythagoreans clearly understood it to mean an ordered thing, an ordered series of things. I've actually done a case study on this word separately, an ordered series of things. And they therefore think, well, I think of the universe as an ordered series of things. Cosmos works to describe this. That's metaphorical. And a lot of new names for scientific things are often metaphor. But we're talking about the vast majority of changes. We're talking about trying to get to subtleties in meaning in different texts.
I had another quick question. This is slightly more speculative, maybe, or maybe a very short two-letter long answer. Even have you thought about, or would you care to speculate about the possibility of using translations as part of the data in the sorts of algorithms you're talking about? For example, if there's a fairly good corpus of aligned translations between Greek and English or Greek and other modern languages now, and how different words that scholars have used to translate these words from different periods might help to measure changes in meaning, and vice versa, whether the sorts of differences and the cosine differences you talk about could be used to feed into translation algorithms. So that's sort of two questions.
No, that's I have thought about. It's hard to implement. It's not impossible. It's quite hard to implement because you're talking about a 3-layer neural network there. The first layer would be dealing with the Greek probabilities of words. The second layer would be dealing with would be matching the Greek on English probabilities, and the third layer would be using some kind of external corpus like Google Books to steady the English references. I actually thought of doing that for my sense detection idea that I briefly mentioned in the end, and I'm still very open to it. I think it would be really cool. But I found that a simpler solution was to take the nearest neighbours that Word2Vec can automatically produce. And you'll find, to use the English example, that like bank, the nearest neighbours will be things like money, finance, water, river. And what you do is you then take the nearest neighbours of those nearest neighbours. You do an algorithm called Chinese whispers clustering, which just clusters for sort of groups that appear to be segmented and different based on the links between them. And that's quite a good way of getting up sense numbers. I've tried that on Greek, for example. It's quite overzealous sometimes. It was able to distinguish between, for example, nous in the 5th century. It identified 2 different senses. It said that there was a sense for a physical ship, what looked like a physical ship, and a sense for the kind of governmental thing, which I think means ship of state. I've not actually looked into it in loads of detail, but it could identify things like that, for example. So that's a way of identifying senses. But I think it would be really cool to use. There's a lot of literature on neural networks for machine translation. I think that would be really cool to adapt to Greek, particularly when you've got open access resources like Perseus. You've got Lerb as well, of course, which is I don't know if they'd let us use that, but but it would be awesome. I think I've also got another question. There's someone who said, can I explain the substitution factor again? Am I okay to go ahead and do that? And there's another one.
Yeah. I was waiting for Gabby if that was the last question he had. If you're happy, we can go into the questions. So the first one is, can you explain substitution factor again?
Okay, so sure. So the idea is this. Let's use an English example, like the word bank. Okay, if you know German, you know that bank is still the word for a bench. And in Old English, it was certainly the word for a bench as well. And so what we say is take a use of that word that is as close as possible to the modern use of the financial institution. As close as possible in sense. So it might be a kind of a bench that's used for giving money or something like that, right? You probably find instances of that because you see modern Greek tapiza as well. So you'll probably find instances of that. And you'd find those 2 senses that as closely as possible align, okay? And then what you're going to do is you're going to say, right, how easy is it using my graded quiz? How easy is it for me to substitute those senses out? Could they easily substitute for each other? Do they mean the same thing? In which case I give it the highest one, 6. Perhaps do I need to change it a little bit? Then I give it 5. Do I need to radically alter and give a concession to the definition? In which case it's 4. 3, do I need to give more than a concession? Do I need to give perhaps an extra clause? 2, it's really quite hard to fit. 1 doesn't fit at all. So that's the idea. I acknowledge that that's crude, and I'm a classicist. I do not think that is in any way a substitution for a whole book's treatment of a word. But we're talking about a means to get to our digital metal detector so that we can automatically detect future things that can inspire more books faster. So we need something crude to bridge that gap. I hope that's well explained. Do comment if that didn't make any sense at all, or tweet me as well. I'm on Twitter.
Okay, and another question from Todd. Can you tell us a little bit about the corpus? I'm not familiar with it. Is it detailed in the repo?
Yes. So actually, on GitHub, the repository, it won't contain the corpus. You'd have to put that in manually, just because it's quite big and it took ages. It would take ages to upload. So it's Barbara McGillivray and Alessandro Vatri and Barbara McGillivray in 2018 as a paper published in Brill about this. They created an open source corpus of Greek texts that was lemmatized. So it's all in XML and very, very easy to access and very, very easy to work with. And I have to say, passing the XML for that was an absolute dream. So thank you, guys. We're so used, I think, in digital humanities to messy XML. It was an absolute dream. So it's amazing to work with. It's called the diaresis corpus. You can look it up. It's really, really good.
That's great.
I've posted a link to the diaresis corpus in the live chat. It should appear there in a minute.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you. Let's wait a little bit to see if we get any more comments or questions. And if not,
I can also talk as well about one of the consequences for classics as well of semantic drift, which is mainly what my thesis is about. Awesome, thank you. It's just mainly what my thesis is about. And when you have semantic drift, you get lots of different words that start to move their senses in different directions. That originally, like the word bank, originally had one monosemous sense and start to move. So you've got riverbank that's moved quite far away because of contextual drift from financial bank, originally the same sense. And what this does is it creates quite fertile ground for literary devices. To use an example that I did a while back, the word dénos, which we know mean terrible and strange, initially starts off being terrible natural events and disasters, and it drifts in, and it talks about the gods as well, and then it becomes terrible natural events and disasters, and it drifts in that direction. It can also drift as well, and it drifts down in the direction of ingenuity and clever ingenuity. So when Sophocles says his famous line, "Polla tadena kuden anthropo denoteron tele," I think I've got that right. He's of the many terrible things, as it's famously translated, none is more fearsome than man, none is more terrible than man. If you read the choral ode as a whole, he's clearly talking about the terrors of natural disasters, and yet man's ingenuity to get through them, or man's ingenuity as it gets through these horrors. So actually what you can see there is he is using two different senses of the word dénos. He's playing with that sense in something, it's a bit, I think German term is Verdautigkeit. He's playing with two different senses of the same word. It's not just multivalent, it's not just poetic. He's actually triggering two different contexts, and that's what creates the literary device, the literary effect. So if we track that semantic drift on a much more detailed level, we can say infinitely more accurate things about literary devices in ancient text. So that's why it's useful to classics.
And I was thinking, you were talking before about the changing meaning of, for example, things like cosmos that you mentioned. If we think about, for example, atlas, that is not necessarily a change in meaning, but in acquiring a name of a character and then attributing it to an atlas of, I think, geographic atlas nowadays, like a collection of maps. Is that the same, or is something different? Is that different?
Well, I'd have to look at the exact cases for that. It may very well be that someone goes, well, Atlas held up the world, so I'm going to metaphorically use this deliberately as a description. That may very well be the case. Or it might be the case that, that the Greeks often were talking about geography in terms of Atlas and gradually it drifts. It may well be either case. It's certainly the case that new uses of words, sudden new coinages, often arise from metaphor and literary devices. But I don't think that's how the vast majority of existing words in a vocabulary of a language gradually changed. That doesn't seem to tally, it doesn't seem to make sense, because if you listen to a new if you listen to a new sense of a word that's totally different from what you expected, you go, what? So it doesn't quite make sense. I think it's much more intuitive to think of it. It's the vast majority of words drift. We are expecting that word senses will drift century to century, even decade to decade. And we need a detailed treatment of that. We can't just be opening up the LSJ, wonderful as it is, and just going, oh, it means that. And we can't just be creating this centralized, monotonous loop of what it means and sort of abstracting that out in each different context, because that's not how we process language. I've got a chapter in my thesis on the neuroscience of language, and the very little that we know, but we know a reasonable amount on how the brain processes standard quotidian language, which I think has an important to contribute to this discussion. There's this idea, I think, that we have this in popular culture, we have this central meaning of a word that pushes out in context, and in context resolves that central meaning of the word. There's not very much evidence for that in terms of the brain and language. It is more complicated than that, but there's not very much evidence for that. So perhaps we should be thinking in the sense of drift, and perhaps we should be thinking about what were the available senses in any given time. And perhaps this is the volcanic soil in which jokes are made, in which metaphor comes alive. And maybe we could stop saying it's just the poetry and start actually tracking the meanings and trying to work out what someone's actually said. Yeah, sorry if I went on a bit there.
No, that's...
So I know that you, all of the discoveries and suggestions that you make, they're suggestions that have to be hand checked, right? I mean, these provide you with questions, not with answers, as you say. But I'm wondering, is there any algorithmic way or anything in the data which can help you to distinguish between meaning change and homonymy, where something that might look like an identical word actually is a completely different word, and that's why the meaning seems to be different?
Okay, so the first thing to say about that is that's quite a lexicographical point of view, that there are some words that are homonyms and some words that just have different senses. This is, again, where neuroscience can kind of help us out a little bit. It's much more of a continuum, that you go from words that are quite polysemous to words that are homonymous. There've been lots of brain imaging studies on, they put people in fMRI machines, subject them to different phrases like bank and belt and must and things, as in must the smell and must the verb, and see what happens. And it seems to be a kind of continuum. Basically, it's about reaction time. Homonymous words you process much faster, because context isolates the meaning much faster, whereas polysemous words take a little bit longer to process. So what we can say from that is that there appears to be some kind of continuum, and I would almost outright, I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, I would almost outright reject the idea that we need to say some words are homonyms and some words are not homonyms. That every word is on a continuum. Some of them are closer together than others, some of them are further away together than others, of course, but I don't think it's as binary as homonyms and polysemes. And so there's that to say. And then there's also, I'm hoping that we will be able to do this through what I was describing as the Chinese whispers sense tracking technology. I'm hoping we'll be able to do this. And particularly if we can do clustering on the senses, and we can do, you can construct something called a centroid, which is the center of the cluster. And you can measure the distance between centroids of clusters to see how far away they are. So maybe that, I mean, I don't know. Perhaps that will help to speed things up, but it's never going to take away the thing that I love doing most, which is trawling through the Greek and being in a library and reading all of the commentaries and trying to work out what it all means. That's the fun of all of it. It's never going to take away from that. We can't get a computer to replace that job. But hopefully we can speed it up.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering about something as simple as the morphological parsing and lemmatization in diaeresis might occasionally distinguish between two words that look similar but actually have different dictionary entries. And again, like my earlier question, this in some ways is your data being contaminated by previous editorial decisions, right? So as with translations, the danger is you're not going to detect any shifts in meaning that haven't already been understood by modern translators, and vice versa. And similarly with the lexicographers have decided that this is two different words, and that may be something you'd rather the software decided rather than, or at least flagged possible questions.
So that in many ways is also a question about how accurate lemmatization is in diaresis as well. I don't know too much about that. I can't comment. Well, what I do know is that in a number of cases, I've found that that it calls the word a slightly different thing sometimes, but that's fine. We can work with that. I have also, by the way, just to address that, the lemmatization in terms of, let's say deo and deo, for example, bind and must. The way that, if you see the GitHub repository, the way that I treated those is they conflate. Word2Vec treats them as the same thing. So they're not considered to be two different entries. And which you may well argue adds to the meaning conflation problem. And you would be correct in doing so.
Okay, so I just posted the link to Diocese with a question. If you have the link for Diocese in the live chat, there it is, if anyone wants to check. And I think if we don't get more questions on the live chat or from the live call, we can finish here the presentation. Thank you very much, Harry. That was brilliant, really interesting. I learned a lot because this is not my field, but it was great. And I have to say, please join us next week with Charlotte Tapman for the next Digital Classicist seminars, if you can, next Friday, as always. So thank you very much, and see everybody soon.
Thank you.